I recently saw Lokesh Kanagaraj's movie DC, and even though the screenplay, especially in the second half, messes up more than once, what stayed with me were the elevation moments, the way obsession sat on that character's face without a single word explaining it. And that got me thinking, how has Indian cinema across decades kept creatively reinventing one single Bengali novel over and over again in language after language and never once run out of new ways to break the same man's heart?
उसका नाम चंद्रा है.
Because believe me when I say this, even though DC is a cross between Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay's Devdas and the real-life American outlaw duo of Bonnie and Clyde, there is a lot that the movie borrows with respect to themes from the classic Bengali novel. And with every adaptation, the characters have creatively evolved over the years.
रोज होती है इस मोहब्बत के केस की सुनवाई. हाय ऑब्जेक्ट, तुम दोषी हो. You are guilty and you drink till death.
And while it would be a pleasure to cover all adaptations, for this video I'll just stick to 3. The 3 movies that I saw in the theatre: Bhansali's 2002 Devdas, Anurag Kashyap's Devdi and DC. But before I get into that, let me know in the comments which Devdas adaptation or inspiration is your favorite. Let's get started. Every telling of this story starts in roughly the same place: a village, a boy and a girl who grew up so close that nobody can name the exact day they fell in love. It was just always true. And this is what leads to the first theme, the wound. By the time Shah Rukh Khan's Devdas comes back from London in Sanjay Leela Bhansali's 2002 version, the closeness between Devdas and Paro has already run into a wall. Paro's maternal lineage of dancers and street performers is enough in that gated, gold-lit version of Bengal for Devdas's mother to call her people beneath the family, even though Paro's father is a zamindar too.
एक तो पड़ोसी का घर, ऊपर से नीच कुल. चलो भूल जाओ कि तुम नीच कुल की हो, लेकिन अपनी औकात का तो ख्याल रखती. अपने खोटे सिक्के को यहाँ चलाने की कोशिश मत करना सुमित्रा.
Swap that gated Bengal mansion for a satellite dish and Anurag Kashyap hands you almost the exact same rejection in 2009, just dressed up as modern hypocrisy instead of old world feudalism. Dev's father won't hear of his son marrying Paro because her family sits one careful rung below him on a ladder nobody in that Punjab town admits still exists.
जाके किसी और का घर बर्बाद कर. वैसे भी औकात नहीं है तेरी हमारे घर में शादी करने की.
And the girl gets married off within weeks to someone chosen for her. Both times almost beat for beat. DC does something stranger with that same wound. Lokesh Kanagaraj's version of Devdas, credited on screen simply as Das, isn't rejected by a girl's family at all. He watches his own uncles murder his mother over a property dispute, and that single act of violence, not heartbreak, not romance, is what turns him into an outlaw in the first place. His Paro figure, a bar singer named Parvati, only shows up after he's already broken while he's hiding from the police in a cheap lodge. He doesn't fall for her as a boy climbing a garden wall. He falls for her as a fugitive who's already killed a man. That difference matters more than it looks on the surface because it quietly changes what each film is talking about. The 2002 and 2009 versions are both about a boy who cannot survive losing one specific girl. DC is about a man who has already survived losing everything else, and on top of that, he loses her too. Leading us to the next theme, the girl who got away. Paro across all 3 versions tells you exactly how each decade thought a woman in this situation was allowed to behave. Aishwarya Rai's Paro in 2002 obeys her parents, marries a man twice her age without a fight, and spends the rest of the film quietly doing what's expected of her, only weeping when the camera decides to let her. But Mahi Gill's Paro in Devdi pushes back a lot harder than that.
तूने इसका सर पूरा रसिका को गाड़ी में घुमाने के बाद तू करे तो सब ठीक और मैं करूँ तो?
She gets frustrated waiting on a Dev who won't commit, marries someone else out of pure spite rather than obedience, and dances at her own wedding instead of quietly enduring it, telling him with every step that she's done waiting for a boy who would rather drown himself than fight for her. Parvati in DC barely gets the runway to become a full character at all. She's a lodge singer, she falls fast, and she's shot dead in a police raid before the film even reaches the second act. So if you are keeping score, the woman gets more voice and more agency as the decades roll forward, but she also gets less and less screen time to use it in. Which brings us to the second woman in every single one of these stories, the one who isn't the childhood sweetheart at all.
Chandramukhi.
Madhuri Dixit's Chandramukhi in 2002 is a courtesan who loves Devdas completely and gets almost nothing back for it. She dances for him, she nurses him, she watches him drink himself apart night after night, and she earns maybe one real line of acknowledgement near his deathbed. Kalki Koechlin's Chanda in Devdi is a sharper, angrier take on the same role. A girl who becomes an escort after a scandal wrecks her reputation and who ends up circling Dev not out of pure sacrifice but because they are both wrecked in oddly compatible ways. She talks back, she calls him out, but she's still mostly reacting to his spiral rather than steering it.
जब तुम्हें पता चला कि गलती तुम्हारी थी, तब भी समय था, लेकिन तुम्हारा ईगो तुमसे बड़ा है। तुम एक बार भी जाके नहीं बोले शादी मत करो। Why should I shut up?
Then you land on Wamiqa Gabbi's Chandra in DC and the role has completely changed shape. She's a traffic sex worker Devdas rescues, so the setup looks familiar at first glance, but she's the one who suggests blackmailing her former clients to replace the money Devdas promised a grieving farmer's family. She's the one who organizes an actual prison break to get him out of police custody. She kills a man herself in the film's back half with her own hands in her own revenge, not his. By the time the credits roll, she and Devdas drive off together as equals, not as a broken man and the woman who quietly stood by him. 100 years after the novel was published, the courtesan finally gets to be the hero of the story.
पहचान वाले लोगों से कुछ नहीं बोलना चाहिए, लेकिन किसी अनजान से आप सब कुछ बोल सकते हो।
किस लिए?
क्योंकि इससे आगे वो बिल्कुल नहीं जाना चाहेगा।
But through all this, there's one familiar trope every Devdas leans on. The bottle.
कौन कमबख्त बर्दाश्त करने को पीता है? हम तो पीते हैं कि यहाँ पर बैठ सकें, तुम्हें देख सकें, तुम्हें बर्दाश्त कर सकें.
Devdas in every single version isn't defined by the girl. He's defined by what he does with the pain once he's got it. And that's where these three films stop looking like three tellings of the same story and start looking like three different diagnoses of the same exact disease. In 2002, the answer was alcohol. Bhansali gives Devdas an entire mansion to drink himself to death. Ismail Darbar's score swells behind every glass he lifts, like the film wants you to mourn him before he's even gone. A slow and operatic collapse that eats up nearly 3 hours of runtime and ends with him literally crawling towards Paro's gate to die within sight of her window. Its grief staged as a spectacle and one of the most beautifully shot tragic scenes in Indian cinema. Absolute genius by Sanjay Leela Bhansali. In 2009, Dev doesn't drink in a mansion. He drinks in cars and clubs and cheap hotel rooms. There is no dignity built into any of it. Amit Trivedi's soundtrack trades the sweeping strings for techno and strobing club music specifically, so you feel how disorienting and low-rent self-destruction actually is when nobody's dressing it up with a symphony. DC throws both of those coping mechanisms out entirely. Devdas picks up a gun and subverts the traditional trope by channeling his despair outward into violent revenge rather than slowly drinking himself to death. Anirudh Ravichandra's music doesn't mourn him, it uplifts him. It's the same wound underneath, the same broken man, but instead of pointing the destruction inward at himself, the way both earlier versions do, DC points it outward at the system he blames for making the world unfair in the first place.
जब कोई कांड करता है तो पुलिस पूछने आती है, लेकिन जब पुलिस कांड करती है तो कौन पूछने आता है?
Even the villain shifts to match. In DC, the enemy finally gets a face and a badge. Corrupt police officers who murder a farmer for his son's tuition money and kill an innocent singer to cover their own mistake. As the decades move forward, the thing crushing Devdas stops being an abstract social code and turns into an actual, nameable, shootable target, which maybe explains why he finally starts shooting back. And this brings us to one other figure worth tracking across all three versions, the father.
अब क्या उस नीच कुल से रिश्ता जोड़कर हम भी अपने खानदान की हंसी उड़वाएं?
In 2002, Devdas's father never really softens at all. He dies still disappointed in his son, and the reconciliation Devdas actually needed simply never arrives. It just gets replaced by more drinking. Devdi barely gives his father figure a redemption arc either. He stays a distant, disapproving presence for most of the runtime, a man Dev mostly just runs from rather than confronts. But DC does something neither of the other two versions bothers to attempt. Before the final ambush, Devdas deliberately arranges a meeting between his estranged father and the farmer's family, sits his father down, actually explains the years of outlawry face to face, and the two of them reconcile before the guns come out. It's a small scene, maybe 4 or 5 minutes of screen time, but it's the one piece of unfinished emotional business that neither Bhansali nor Kashyap ever bothered to close for their versions of the character. Therefore, DC isn't just letting Devdas survive the girl he loves, it's letting him settle every other open wound. The mother's death, the father's disapproval, the broken promise to a stranger's family before it ever lets him pick up a weapon for the final fight. This might sound like a small detail, but it tells you something bigger about how each film defines healing. Which brings us to the ending, and there are 3 completely different endings to what is, underneath everything, the exact same story. Shah Rukh Khan's Devdas dies. He fails to reach Paro's gate before he collapses, and the last thing you see is a running towards a door that's being locked against her by her own household, arriving 1 second too late. It is by design one of the saddest endings in Hindi cinema, the kind you are meant to admire even while it wrecks you. Devdi refuses to hand you that clean version of sadness. Dev survives, and then the film ends with him wandering into an ambiguous, half-hopeful future alongside Chanda. Neither of them healed, both of them still standing. It's not a happy ending. It's just a living one which somehow feels harder to earn. DC goes even further than that. Devdas and Chandra don't just survive, they actually win. They wipe out the police task force responsible for Parvati's death. Devdas reconciles with the father who disowned him years earlier. He finally hands over the money he promised a grieving family, and he drives away from the story with the woman standing next to him instead of the one buried behind him. Even Kitty, the last surviving member of his gang, makes it out alive. Nobody in this version is required to die so the audience can feel something. Line those 3 endings up next to each other and you are not just watching 3 movies anymore. You're watching 100 years of Indian cinema slowly change its mind about a broken man is actually supposed to do with his pain. Die beautifully for it, survive it messily without applause, or turn it into fuel and win.
उसका नाम चंद्रा है.
But 3 different endings for the same broken man raise a bigger question. Why does this story keep getting told at all? And I think that the real reason is that this story was never really about a story of a one man named Devdas. Strip away the zamindar houses and the police chases, and what you are left with is one of the most universal shapes heartbreak can take. A person who can't have the one they wanted, so they stop wanting anything good for themselves at all. Almost everyone has had a Devdas era. Maybe not literally, but figuratively. Some people might still be living in it right now without even knowing that's the name for it. Which is probably why DC is the one that actually sent me looking backward into the other 2. Sitting in that theater watching a man's obsession play out almost entirely on his face, I wasn't thinking about a Bengali novel from 1917. I was just reacting to a well-built elevation moment. Bhansali's version and Kashyap's version had already been sitting with me from earlier viewings, but it took me watching DC and clocking how differently it ends compared to the other 2 to actually connect the 3 into one line. For once, the guy lives. For once, he gets to put the gun down, get in the car and drive away with someone who actually chose to be there. None of these 3 films are objectively the definitive Devdas, and honestly, I don't think that title exists or should. What I do think is that watching them back to back in order isn't really watching 3 different remakes of an old novel. It's watching 3 different generations diagnose the exact same broken heart using whatever language their decade had available to them. There's also something worth noting in how each Devdas chooses to carry his grief alone or with people around him. Shah Rukh Khan's version isolates himself almost completely. He pushes away the one servant who actually cares about him and drinks in a house that gets emptier by the scene. Dev in 2009 is technically surrounded by people at every party and every club, but he's just as alone inside that crowd as Devdas is inside his mansion. Maybe more so, because at least Devdas knows he's isolated. Das in DC is the only version who never drifts off on his own. He keeps a small crew around him the entire film. Sebastian, Kitty, Chandra, people who show up for him even when it costs him everything. That's maybe the quietest evolution of all 3. The shift from grief as something you're supposed to suffer through by yourself to grief as something a small found family can actually help carry.
You're goddamn right.
That's my take on how I view the evolution of Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay's Devdas through film adaptations over the last 2 decades. My favorite Devdas adaptation is Sanjay Leela Bhansali's Devdas. It's also one of my favorite SRK performances. Let me know your favorite in the comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already and check out my podcast with Filmy Prem right here. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.